1,000 years have passed, and the continent of Eurathia lies in the ashes of a forgotten past, where kingdoms once prosperous are now but memories lost in the wind. But among these ruins, a legend rises, a name that echoes through time, marked by blood and ambition of one man, Aureus Dravian, the conqueror of 1,000 battles. He wasn't born noble, didn't inherit a throne. He was an orphan soldier forged by war, a man without family, without destiny, until the day the iron of destruction and the gold of glory crossed his path. With every battle he won, his name grew, and with it a shadow of fear. They said the gods had marked his face with a golden scar, a scar that would transform him into something more than human, something immortal. But what would this mark be but a sign that he was destined to rule, that war would be his only truth? Aureus was no ordinary leader. He unified the 7 kingdoms of Eurathia with deadly precision. He conquered cities, killed traitors, and destroyed entire armies. And as his fame grew, so did the army that followed him. The Iron Lions, his legion, marched with him, invincible, believing that the lightning that struck the skies was a divine sign, a blessing from the gods. Every thunder, every bolt was a promise of victory. They marched, and the world trembled. He marched, and the enemies fell. When Aureus finally reached Raphmore, the city that represented the last resistance to his empire, he didn't just conquer, he destroyed. He ordered the palace of eternal columns to be built, with statues of his defeated enemies serving as pillars of his glory. He was at the height of his power, and with it the certainty that his empire would never fall. But, as all know, power has a price. On a stormy night, when the fury of the skies seemed to reflect the weight of his own soul, Aureus climbed to the top of the palace of eternal columns. The wind howled, and the clouds gathered like a harbinger. He raised his arms as if he were about to challenge the very gods themselves. And it was there, under the storm, that he made an oath that would change the fate of all. "Grant me 1,000 years of glory, and I will accept 1,000 years of condemnation." Those words echoed through the sky like thunder answering the command of a god. Lightning tore the heavens, and a golden scar burned on his face. Aureus was no longer just a man. He had become a legend, forever marked by the promise of the gods. Half man, half god. He had everything, but at the cost of his very soul. But did the gods truly keep their word? What happened after those words would never be forgotten. The empire of Valtharion, now in Aureus's hands, seemed invincible. But the arrogance of power is blind, and Aureus's story would be marked by something much greater than a mere conquest. He had made the pact, but what he didn't know was that the price of glory would be much higher than he ever imagined. As his empire expanded, something began to change, something no one expected. What seemed invincible was starting to crumble. But that, of course, is another story, and the true battle, the one that would define whether he would be remembered as a god or a defeated man, was about to begin. Stay with me, for what comes next is something you could never imagine.
After the battle against his own son, Aureus Dravian found himself surrounded by the darkness of his own empire. He had conquered more than anyone could imagine, but at an unimaginable cost. The empire was in ruins, and as he gazed at the horizon, he no longer saw the golden fields of Valtharion, but a land marked by pain and loss. His enemies had fallen, his followers had fallen, and now he was alone, with the weight of his own pact becoming unbearable. The storm that once seemed to be his ally, his blessing, was now a constant reminder that the price of his glory was being paid with every thunder that tore through the skies. Aureus walked through the empty streets of Valtherion, his heavy boots echoing like a grim shadow through the stone walls that once vibrated with the sounds of celebration and victory. He had everything, but everything had been taken from him. Everything except the power he never knew when to let go of. He was lost. Aureus could not deny the truth that had been imposed upon him. The glory he had sought with such veracity had turned into a burden, and the empire he had built, the grand Valtherion, was now nothing more than a shadow of what it had once been. He no longer cared for the throne, nor the lands he had once conquered. His gaze was fixed on the void, on what he had lost. In that mortal silence that filled the ruins of his empire, he saw something that would haunt him forever, his own humanity, lost in an unrelenting pursuit of more power. And it was at that moment that he knew the true battle was not against the enemies that had fallen, nor the sons who had rebelled. The true battle was against himself, against the pact he had made with the gods of war, against the condemnation he had accepted without thinking of the consequences. He had sold his soul for 1,000 years of glory, but the price of 1,000 years of condemnation was his very soul. It was then, on a moonless night, that a presence manifested before him. It emerged from the shadows of the ancient capital of Valtherion, a figure in a dark cloak, seemingly floating, not walking, as if it were in some kind of trance, caught in the threshold between the world of the living and the dead. Aureus, with his empty gaze, watched it with a mixture of curiosity and despair. The figure stopped before him, without a word, but Aureus could feel the weight of its presence. It was as if time itself had bowed to its will. The general felt a pressure in his chest, a strange sensation, as if something inside him was being called, drawn toward that figure. The figure spoke, its voice low and filled with a mystical force, as if it were made of wind and thunder. You wanted power, Aureus. You wanted to be eternal. Now you know the price. Aureus did not respond immediately. The words were like a blow to his chest, reminding him of everything he had lost. But the figure continued, without moving, its eyes fixed on Aureus's, as if it could see beyond the physical, beyond the body, going straight to the heart of his soul. You sacrificed your son, the only thing that still connected you to what is most human within you. Now you are a broken man, wandering through an empire of ruins, ruling an army that no longer follows you, only the legend you became. Aureus was silent, his hands clenched, trembling with anger and despair. He wanted to shout, to contest the words of this figure that seemed to know more about him than he knew about himself. But he knew it was right. The price of glory had been much higher than he had ever imagined. He had sacrificed what was most precious to him, his son, and with that he had lost his very essence. You believe the gods blessed you, but you were deceived. What you see as a blessing is in fact a curse disguised. True glory is not eternal, and you will not be remembered for the empire you built, but for the lives you destroyed in your relentless pursuit. These words were like spears piercing Aureus's heart. What had he done? He looked at the ruins around him, where once stood the palaces, the fortresses, the temples he had ordered to be built in the name of his glory. Now nothing remained. And what did he have left? A golden scar on his face and an empire of ashes. He had become more than a legend. He had become a sad story, marked by tragedy and loss. The figure, still floating in the shadows, seemed to lean toward him closer, as if it wanted to touch his soul with the raw truth. Aureus felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if he was being watched by something beyond death, something beyond the gods. And then the figure made one final revelation. The battle you fought against your son, against the empire, against your own gods, was only the beginning. The pact you made with the gods of war will not be fulfilled the way you expect. There will be no rest. There will be no peace. Because you are trapped, Aureus, trapped in the legend you created. And as long as there is a trace of life in the ruins of Valtherion, you will be forced to face the consequences of your desire for eternal glory. These words echoed in Aureus's mind like distant thunder, a sound that would never cease. He could not escape. He was condemned to live for 1,000 years. But live as what? A legend, a specter. He knelt, his head bowed, feeling the weight of the condemnation that now accompanied him. The silence stretched between him and the figure, and before he could respond or even ask, the figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving him alone again, with the storm raging in the sky above. Aureus rose, looking at the horizon. What was left for him now? A never-ending struggle, a condemnation he had chosen for himself. He knew his journey would not end, that he would never rest until his debt was paid. But what would be the final price? He was beginning to understand that, as long as he lived, the torment of loss, pain, and empty glory would accompany him. And so, the legend of Aureus Dravian would continue without end. Because a man's true war is not fought in the battles he wins, but in the shadows of his own soul. And he, now, was trapped forever in the darkness of his own creation.
Aureus was at the peak of his glory. His empire stretched from horizon to horizon, and he ruled with an iron fist as if he were the very lord of the gods. But there was something he couldn't control, something that even he, with all his might, could not subjugate. Time. The pact he made that stormy night, the oath he gave to the gods, was now weighing heavily on his soul, more than any sword or army. The price of glory, the promised condemnation, was beginning to reveal itself in ways he could not have foreseen. The first signs of his fall began in the distant provinces, where governors and leaders began to rebel against the authority of Valtherion. Sons of the empire, descendants of Aureus, began turning on one another. The battle for the throne had begun. The struggle for succession would become one of the greatest challenges of the general himself. But the greatest sacrifice of all was yet to come. His only son, the heir to the empire, whom he had raised and trained to follow in his footsteps, rose up against him. And it wasn't just a fight for power. It was something deeper, more cruel. It was the painful culmination of a pact Aureus had made with the gods, something he could no longer control. The winds howling over Valtherion were charged with a fury that could only be called vengeance. A dark and silent night fell over the empire, and Aureus received news he could never have imagined hearing. His own son, the only legacy of his dynasty, was rising against him, seeking to take the throne and perhaps destroy his very father. That night, Aureus would face his greatest enemy. But it wouldn't just be any enemy. It wouldn't be any army or traitor. No. His greatest enemy was his own blood, his own flesh, and his own spirit. Before the gates of Valtherion, amid the storm that he had long believed to be his blessing, he prepared for battle. The sky seemed to tear open, as if the very universe itself was witnessing the pain that tore through the general's heart. There was no more glory, no more conquests. What remained now was only a man with the sword, facing the son he loved and had trained to be his successor. "I made the pact, my son," said Aureus, his voice heavy with unbearable sorrow, "but I can no longer pay the price." The thunder roared like wild beasts around them, and the battle began. Aureus and his son fought a brutal, relentless battle. The clash of swords rang out with a deafening sound, as if the very heavens themselves wanted to interrupt the confrontation. But nothing could interrupt the destiny that was already sealed. The climax of the battle wasn't just the defeat of an empire or the loss of a life. It was the sacrifice of a father who, in the end, would have to choose between saving his son and keeping the power he had so desperately sought. The choice was impossible, and he knew it. In that final moment, when the swords crossed for the last time, Aureus didn't think of the glory he had conquered, nor the empire he had built. He thought only of the pact he had made, and the price he still had to pay. And with one final blow, he did the impossible. He sacrificed his own son, the last vestige of his humanity. His son's blood fell to the ground of Valtharion, and the storm ceased. The empire was finally silent. The general's fate was sealed, but that of his empire was now lost. What remained was the legend of a man who, in seeking eternity, destroyed everything he loved. But Aureus Dravian's story doesn't end here. No, it only begins to transform into something much darker. The sacrifice of his son was only the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that would begin to write itself in the clouds, where perhaps everyone's fate rested at the mercy of a man who could never be defeated.
After the sacrifice of his own son, Aureus Dravian's empire fell into a deep, suffocating silence, as if the gods themselves were mourning the tragedy that had unfolded. The land, once vibrant with the strength of his armies, now seemed empty, consumed by the loss of a legacy that would never be fulfilled. The general, now with a broken heart and a soul marked by an unbearable pain, wandered through the ruins of his empire. Aureus had made the pact, but the gods, as always, had demanded their price. He had become more than a man. He had become a legend. But the legend he had created was built upon lies, betrayals, and now the sacrifice of his own blood. And what is a legend but a story distorted by time, forgetting who truly paid the price? The storm that once seemed to bless his journey was now a curse that haunted him. The sky, in its fury, seemed to reflect the emptiness in his chest. He walked through the ruins of what remained of Valtharion, the echoes of his own cries of pain mixed with the distant roar of the wind. The war, which had once brought him glory, was now a prison of eternal anguish. But something unusual began to happen. The legends about him, about his pact, began to spread. Some said that Aureus Dravian was still alive, walking through the shadows, searching for something he himself didn't know. Others, bolder, swore he had become an immortal being, doomed to lead the Iron Lions for all eternity. There were even those who claimed to have seen his army marching in the clouds, a terrifying vision where Aureus led his troops into a war that would never end. And then the reports began to get more concrete. Travelers who dared risk the old roads of Eurathia, where the empire of Valtharion once stood, claimed that on stormy nights a strange and powerful presence could be felt in the air. A vast army, made of clouds and lightning, marched in the skies. At the head of them, a towering figure in golden armor and a red cloak, guiding his troops with indescribable force. Aureus Dravian was not dead. He was trapped by the pact he had made with the gods, trapped by the fate he had chosen. The general could not die, for his glory would not fade as long as there was a soul willing to remember him. He could not rest, for the price of glory was not just the sacrifice of his son, but the eternal pursuit of power and control that would never leave him. Centuries passed, but the stories of the general grew stronger. Those who dared to speak of him in taverns and marketplaces swore that on particularly dark nights they could hear the sound of heavy boots marching in the distance, and in the thunder the low laughter of Aureus could be heard echoing across the mountains and valleys as if he were about to begin another battle. The empire of Valtharion had fallen, but the name of Aureus Dravian would never be forgotten. He was now a living legend, a force that defied time itself, and those who sought power, those who longed for glory, knew that if they dared to follow the path of the Iron Lions, they would have to pay the price. The same price Aureus had paid, the loss of everything he loved. On stormy nights, one can still see, even today, the army marching in the clouds, led by Aureus. He and his Iron Lions continue to seek a war that will never end. Because after all, the greatest punishment for those who seek eternal glory is not death, but the condemnation of never being able to enjoy what they have conquered. And so, the story of Aureus Dravian lives on, a legend that transcends time and space, a shadow that remains, waiting for the next battle. His war will never end, and the empire of Valtharion, though destroyed, will never fade from the memory of those who still believe that glory is worth any sacrifice. Now that you know the story of Aureus Dravian, the man who paid the price of eternal glory, I invite you to reflect. How far would you go to achieve what you desire most? What sacrifice would you be willing to make? If you enjoyed this epic tale and want to hear more legends like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Leave your thoughts about the story of Aureus Dravian in the comments and share it with your friends who love intense, mysterious stories.